Lawyers for impeached South Korean President Yoon Yeol have lashed out at his indictment for insurrection, calling it the worst decision.
They accuse prosecutors of currying favor with political forces seeking Mr. Yoon's ouster. In a statement, his defense team said the indictment will remain a shame in the history of South Korean prosecutors that they cannot erase, stressing that the president's declaration of martial law cannot ever be a rebellion.
The prosecutors indicted Mr. Yoon on charges of leading an insurrection with his short-lived martial law decree last month, accusing him of being the ringleader. This makes him the first sitting president in the country's history to be charged while under detention.
South Korea's opposition welcomed the decision, with Democratic Party spokesperson Han Min-soo saying it was the start of punishment of, quote, the ringleader of insurrection. While Mr. Yoon's detention was due to end today, prosecutors had sought to extend it twice, but a Seoul court rejected it.
By law, a suspect must be released if not indicted within a detention period. So his indictment with detention now means Mr. Yoon will stay behind bars until his case goes to trial.
Insurrection is one of the few charges a South Korean president doesn't have immunity from. The country's criminal law defines insurrection as an attempt to overthrow the government organs established by the Constitution or to render the exercise of their functions impossible by force. The offense is punishable by life imprisonment or death.
Separately, President Yoon faces the Constitutional Court, which will decide whether to uphold his impeachment by Parliament. If it does, he'll be forced out of office. National polls to choose his successor must then be held within 2 months.
And for more on President Yoon's indictment and the path forward, let's speak with Jeremy Chan. He's Senior Analyst, China and Northeast Asia with the Eurasia Group. And he joins us live from Washington, D.C. Jeremy, good to see you again. Let's start with the CIO. They handed the case to prosecutors on Friday and asked for him to be charged with rebellion, with abuse of power, and obstruction of the National Assembly. So is it clear why prosecutors have only gone ahead with the rebellion charge? And I'm wondering what the implications are for Mr. Yoon when it comes to a rebellion charge.
That's a good question, Arnold. Thanks for having me. I think that the prosecutor's office was trying to indict Yoon on the strongest charge before them. And there was also a timing matter at play here as well, because as you noted, had they not brought the indictment, he would have been released from detention as early as Tuesday, because the Seoul court twice last week refused to extend his arrest warrant. And so I think the prosecutor's office was afraid, A, that he would have been released to back to his residence, and we would have re-entered the cycle where it was difficult to bring him in for questioning. But more fundamentally, the prosecutor's office is trying to accelerate the removal of Yoon formally from office, which we believe more likely to happen through the impeachment channel rather than the criminal investigation that took part with the indictment.
And Jeremy, so given the serious charges against Mr. Yoon, what do you think his team's strategy will be moving forward? Will their focus on discrediting the charges and legality of the investigation hold water?
Yeah, so Yoon's lawyers have signaled quite clearly that A, they will not cooperate with the criminal investigation. They view it fundamentally as illegitimate, and that he's essentially immune from these charges. B, they argue that declaring martial law, as he did in early December, is a simple exercise of a legal authority that's granted to the president under the Constitution, that he never intended to disrupt state organs or normal sort of democratic processes within the country. And C, more fundamentally, you saw the Constitutional Court last week a legal strategy whereby the sort of inner circle that enabled and helped Yoon to carry out martial law in early December, particularly the former defense minister, that there's a sort of circling the wagons effect that's happening now with the former defense minister essentially trying to fall on his sword and take blame for both the planning and the execution of martial law while trying to excuse Yoon's behavior in that. So that's kind of the tripart strategy of Yoon and his lawyers.
Jeremy, I want to ask you about what the Constitutional Court is doing, running hearings in parallel. I'm just wondering, how much of a bearing will things like the indictment and, I guess ongoing investigations, have in terms of an impact on what the court is doing right now, the Constitutional Court? or is there no bearing at all?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I think at the margin, this will apply additional pressure. There's already tremendous amounts of pressure on the court to issue a ruling as quickly as possible to essentially move the country beyond its current sort of political crisis in which it finds itself. It's already on its second acting president, for example, and there's a leadership vacuum, particularly as Seoul needs to be doing some proactive diplomacy with the new Trump team in Washington. And so the court will, at the margin, probably accelerate its proceedings a bit and could issue a ruling, we believe, as early as late February, more likely sometime in March, which would then, as you noted earlier, sort of set off the timer for presidential elections, which need to follow within 60 days. So somewhere likely in May or June. That's what the court is facing right now. But at the same time, this entire process by the center-left main opposition party to accelerate Yoon's indictment, removal from office, and therefore follow-on elections is not going to come without a political cost. And you see that in surveys across Korea right now, where support for the conservative party, the party of Yoon, is surging, is now far higher than it was before Yoon declared martial law on December 3rd. And you actually see center-right and further-right candidates defeating center-left opposition leader Lee Jae-myung in head-to-head matchups, theoretical matchups at this point. So this is actually a pretty risky political strategy that the left is undertaking, in my view.
Yeah, time is certainly ticking, Jeremy. And as you mentioned, presidential campaign discussions are already heating up in Korea with opposition leader Lee Jae-myung leading in presidential preferences where it comes to within his party, while the conservative side remains more, I guess, fragmented with several potential figures emerging. What sort of candidates are you closely watching out for as the race sort of takes shape?
That's a very good question, Julie. I mean, if you look at surveys right now, the candidates that seem to be capturing the most sort of support right now on the right are further right candidates. Basically, candidates like Labor Minister Kim Moon-soo, for example, or Daegu Mayor Hong Joon-pyo, who are less apologetic about Yoon's declaration of martial law and have defended him from the very beginning and the legitimacy of that action. You see them performing better in head-to-head matchups than more center-right candidates like Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hoon, for example, or former PPP chairman Han Dong-hoon. So right now, if we had to place a wager on it, we would think that somebody from the further right, somebody like a Kim Moon-soo, would be the most likely candidate to win the nomination. But with that said, the swing vote in this election will be the sort of unaffiliated 1/3 of the country that kind of swings between left and right depending upon the political moment. They're the ones that are swinging decisively into the conservative camp over the last month. And the PPP would risk losing some of those voters were they to nominate somebody that came too far from the right or was too much of a sort of apologist for Yoon and his declaration of martial law. So that will all play out in the next couple of months.
So Jeremy, can you explain why that shift is sort of taking place at this moment among those who kind of sit in the middle?
It's a very good question. I mean, if you look at polling in December, there was this broad swell of support for the center left, right? The party that was prosecuting, quote unquote, Yoon and trying to remove him from office. But in the last 3 or 4 weeks, there's been this kind of broad kind of consensus within South Korea that the center left is overreaching a bit and is probably politicizing the legal process too much. And that's partly because the leader of the opposition, Mr. Lee, is also facing his own series of legal troubles that could, by May, disqualify him from participating in the next presidential election. And so I think the average voter in South Korea is now seeing that the center left is probably trying to overly politicize this process for their own benefit and is therefore not a lot better than Yoon was on the right. And so I think you see real distaste growing among that kind of unaffiliated bloc for the tactics of the center left. And you see them supporting the center right, the conservatives, in greater number now.
All right, Jeremy, thank you very much. Appreciate you talking to us. As always, Jeremy Chan is Senior Analyst with the Eurasia Group, talking to us from Washington, D.C.